Good evening. I'm Carla Sinopoli, and I am the director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan. And I am delighted to welcome you to the final lecture of our fall lecture series, which we have called It's Alive, Rediscovering Museums of Living Collections. Throughout this series, we have attempted to bring representatives of institutions of living or of once living collections, including zoos and aquariums, botanical gardens and arboretums, and anatomical collections, into conversations with the larger theoretical and ethical debates in the field of museum studies, a field that has all too often privileged collections of art and artifacts and not paid attention to the full breadth of the many kinds of museums and the many kinds of collections they hold. So our hope in this series has been to explore both the specific challenges and issues faced by museums of living collections, as well as to address issues common to all museums, issues of ethics, display, ownership, authenticity, and the changing role of institutional authority. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Hicks, director of the Mütter Museum, an historical medical library, and the William Mulmese Chair for the History of Medicine at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, a place that is home to both the oldest professional society in the United States and is federally recognized as the birthplace of American medicine. Dr. Hicks will tell us much more about these extraordinary institutions, but first I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Hicks. Robert Hicks joined the Mütter Museum, an historical medical library, as its director in 2008. He earned his doctorate in maritime history at the University of Exeter, having received a BA in anthropology and archaeology, and an MA in applied anthropology, where he minored in television production at the University of Arizona. As befits this diverse academic background, he has had a wide-ranging career as a naval officer in the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, teaching in universities, and working and consulting in museums and historical organizations, including work as the director of the Roy Edelman Institute for Interpretation and Education of the Chemical Heritage Foundation, which he held from 2003 to 2007, and as director of Loxodrome History Consultants, a foundation he is still involved with, and which he has been involved with since 1993. At the Mütter, in addition to his directorial responsibilities, he's been actively involved in the development of new exhibitions, including, most recently, The Devouring Element, which examines lead's impact on health, and a major new permanent exhibition on the medical dimensions of the Civil War, entitled Broken Bodies, Suffering Spirits, Injury, Death, and Healing in Civil War Philadelphia. In addition, Dr. Hicks is the author of 2 books, more than 50 essays and articles. And tonight, he will address the contradictory and challenging messages that anatomical displays convey to visitors as he explores our dialogue with the dead in museums. And right before I introduce him, I do want to ask you that when we get to the question period, please wait for the microphones to come around to you, because we are videotaping this talk and we want to catch every word you say. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Hicks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that frighteningly intimate introduction to me. I thought, did I do those things? Thank you all for coming out. I'm very pleased to be here, very honored to be invited to come out and speak as part of this series. And if I'm the final speaker in the series, maybe we could inject a little nice irony, since the series it's alive, and here I've got death, and there's a lot more death to come. Let me begin here. About 10 years ago, in one 15 minutes of fame moment, The BBC reported on an unusual circumstance. It took place on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, an area that we will certainly not characterize as peaceful and stable today. Well, it certainly wasn't 10 years ago. And here's what happened. With all of the dislocation, constant fighting, alternate economies developed. In this case, looting of archaeological materials. And you all recall the Taliban destroying cultural resources in Afghanistan when they were running the show. So a body turns up, intercepted by the military at the border, and it appears to be a mummy, and you see it here. This was a mummy with a gold faceplate. You can see it in the image. You can see a leaf-shaped object around the torso, and it's encased in something. And these scientists are trying to figure it out. Well, what was unusual about this is this body purported to be of a woman. It was in a wooden sarcophagus. There was an inscription on the sarcophagus that was preliminarily dated to Persian, about AD 8th century, and possibly a Persian princess who was well known from historical records. So people got excited about this. But even as this hit the press, even as it comes into the news as an illegally dug up and trafficked item of cultural significance and perhaps historical significance, prices are mooted on the internet. There are already collectors interested in this commodity. So tens of thousands of dollars are already being spun out for consideration to lure interest. Further investigation showed that something was just not right. The inscription wasn't quite right. The wood of the sarcophagus was legitimately old. The gold pieces were legitimate artifacts from the era of several centuries ago. But the mummy appeared to have been mummified according to thousands of years old Egyptian techniques. That just was not right for Persia. So further analysis revealed that there's a woman inside, but this woman had been murdered approximately 2 years before the discovery of the thing here, and apparently murdered specifically to fake an artifact. This would have been a Pakistani woman. She was killed by a blow to the back of the head. We don't know who she is, and most likely there was no one looking for her. So here's somebody murdered to fake another dead person. That is a commodity for illicit trade for which there is a demand. And the fact that prices were already being thrown out through the internet to lure attention also tells you that there's huge interest, particularly in the West, for cultural objects of this kind, particularly human bodies that have certain historical associations. Keep that thought. So I retired from the criminal justice system, have had a long association with museums, but for about 8 years I ran a program to teach law enforcement officers about investigating crimes of looting cultural resources. So that particular incident really caught my imagination. And the corpse in the box is actually nothing within my experience, but it's a smuggled infant excavated and smuggled out of Thailand and intercepted by customs officials. The other 3 pictures I took, and the bones down below were illegally excavated remains of a Union soldier who was killed at a Civil War battle outside of Richmond, Virginia. So, as you see from the ad, there is a demand for human material, dead. There's a demand for artifacts connected with the dead, but there's particularly a market for corpses that have some sort of historical or cultural association of interest to us Western museum people and collectors. So this is part of the background of some of the issues I'd like to throw out for you. So I want to talk about not only the exhibition, the display of basically human corpses, but also about the imagery of the dead. And part of the fascination with this topic I have is not just as a museum director, but on one point, that some of the issues, some of the concerns connected with keeping corpses in museum collections and displaying them are identical to the issues about keeping and interpreting, promoting images of the dead. So I'm going to go back and forth in this presentation about the images and the actual corpse. But the privilege issue is one that continues to follow us around. And since I'm the director of a medical museum, which does have corpses, this is a constant topic of conversation, and it's a topic for students who come and research in our collections, and occasionally we piss off people just by virtue of what we are. So there is a privilege issue, and it's raised rather frequently, and it's not necessarily because we possess some Persian princess, but it's because the corpses we have are us. Sometimes they are culturally or ethnically distinct, but not always. But the possession of the image, possession of the corpse, its display are pretty much identical issues where I'm concerned. And there are certain cross-culture issues that I want to briefly alight on that are driving, I think, a new thinking in museums such as mine about how we do business with human corpses when we are purportedly scientific institutions, culture institutions at the same time, and we are displaying human dead. Globalization is affecting this picture, particularly because of non-Western peoples who a century ago did not have a voice to protest, now have a voice to protest in many cases, and also have the legal means to pursue when they're not being heard. Now, when I was working in law enforcement, I ended up coming to the conclusion that museums just shouldn't display human remains, from an Egyptian mummy to anything else. So fate decreed that I should now come to work at a place which is effectively Corpses Are Us. So I am wrestling with these issues. So the dialogue that I want to promote really traverses these areas. And briefly, I'm going to take a look at historical dimension, particularly in terms of the visual arts and the heritage, a heritage in the visual arts that speaks to how we display the dead, how we display human bodies, how we display human viscera. And there are some threads running through that visual history that still have a very powerful hold on the dialogue we're having now. The art critical scene is a particularly astonishing feature of our dialogue with the dead. Example, the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. this past summer had a performance artist who did a number of performances throughout the summer, characterized by having a nurse appear in the performance and actually draw the performer's blood. The blood was then taken and used as the medium of an artistic expression. Well, you can imagine something like that raises some eyebrows. We have performance artists today who are exhibiting their bodies as canvases for political interpretation, for other purposes, but it's not uncommon to find artists using their own bodies as a medium of expression. This was not always so. And just a generation ago, this was very politically hot stuff. So the anthropological dimension of this topic is the part that's really not new. Anthropology has always been interested in our rituals of our life experience and how we handle death, how we die, how we express our grief. This is all anthropological territory. And so what churns in anthropology continues to inform the dialogue. The museological part of this I've been hitting on with some points I've been trying to make so far, particularly with the picture with Afghanistan and Pakistan, how we get bodies. But the legal environment continues to change about what is permissible, what can one keep, how can one display human bodies, in what ways. Where Native Americans are concerned, there is legislation that didn't exist 30 years ago that protects Native American human remains, particularly to go after museums like ours, like the Smithsonian, like here at the university, where Native American remains were willy-nilly gathered, and in some cases, Native Americans murdered in order to obtain those remains. And of course, no tribal authorities were consulted in any of this. Obviously, the people who had the anthropologists were not the Native Americans, they were white guys like us, and they ran the institutions. So the legal dimension I've already mentioned, but we were going to come through all these territories. So we're talking about a post-mortem gaze here, and now you start seeing some objects from our own collection. And the post-mortem gaze is something that, at least in my museum, we talk about all the time. the real trial of the prospective intern working at the Mütter Museum is, can you survive the conversation at the Mütter lunch table? And absolutely anything goes. And if you don't believe me, then after the presentation, ask me about the special file that we shared with Mary Roach, if any of you read her books. Aha. And it's in her latest book. She was absolutely fascinated. So this is us. We have on the back table there some rack cards about our museum and rack cards about our new exhibit called Broken Bodies, Suffering Spirits. But we very humbly bear the mantle of birthplace of American medicine. Philadelphia really is the city of medical first. First hospital, first medical school, first women's college of medicine, first school of optometry. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Although, can't claim first school of dentistry. And you've got an excellent dentistry museum here. So we do have this national landmark status. The Mütter Museum is part of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. It is not a teaching college, but a professional fraternal organization, and as the introduction pointed out, one of the oldest in the country. So the physicians who are fellows and have been fellows for the last 225 years were people who began these other medical institutions and were basically pathfinders in medical care. So here's our museum. We've got all these things, and a fraction of them are on display. In a way, we are an historical accident, because if we were part of a university, we probably wouldn't exist anymore. But we're very much an independent institution. Universities that created medical schools had collections for a time and then got rid of them. And they're not much in evidence anymore in medical schools. They're not considered useful for training. So we have this collection for doctors only. At least that's how it was started. But it's now transformed into a popular visiting place. We are reputedly a great date place. We have marriages that take place in our museum. And so keep that in mind if you're looking for something unusual. So the cast, by the way, that you see in the middle, I see I shouldn't stand next to the mics. The original Siamese twins, Chang and Eng, their autopsy was actually performed at our college with the consent of the family. And it was done to find out if they could have been separated in life and lived. The answer was no, but this cast was taken following the autopsy, and we have the cast as well as the preserved conjoined liver, if you care to come and see them. Descendants of people whose remains are in the museum visit all the time. There are a lot of offspring of Chang and Eng. You may know that they married, had 21 kids between them, and their descendants continue to come and visit. So this is our namesake founder, Dr. Thomas Dent Mütter. Died young, good-looking guy. He bequeathed the collection that started the Mütter Museum, which opened 150 years ago. Now, his reason for creating this museum was didactic, and it was meant for physicians to consult, but not exclusively. His legal agreement with the college stipulated that artists should have access to the collection. Sketching opportunities should be permitted, which is very interesting because the history of visual arts, depiction of human anatomy, is absolutely entwined with the history of medicine. Artists frequently had better anatomical knowledge than some of the physicians practicing their trade. And if you're curious about the object in the middle, she's one of my favorites. She's a wax head of Madame Sunday, Madame Dimanche, and that is a horn growing out of her head. That is not a door knocker. But for what it's worth, that is not connected to the bone, in case you're interested. That's like a big fingernail, just growing where it's not supposed to be. And she let it grow that long before she was almost 80 years old and had it removed. And it wasn't the only horn she had. And wax is a wonderful medium, particularly in a medical museum, where you have wax simulations of human features, because wax will behave like skin. It will even sweat under the right conditions. It's very eerie. I'm always telling visitors, if you see something in a jar in our museum with liquid in it, it's real. If there's no liquid in it, it's a wax model. So we also have an historical medical library component, and until recently, these were considered very separate domains. So we have all this. And I mention as a footnote, for any of you that might find yourselves with a good idea that involves our collections, we have a travel grant program that can fly you out and put you up so that you could work with our collections. And you do not have to be necessarily any PhD scholar with a 10-page CV. Just have a good idea. So the purposes of the collection, certainly teaching was Dr. Mutter's intention. Also contemplation. And that's interesting to see physicians even talk about these things, which they don't do with the public, but they did with each other. And they did appreciate that the museum of artifacts, of the specimens, was also a melancholy place to contemplate mortality, and it was sort of their institutional memento mori. It's interesting to find doctors comment on that, which they would never say to the public. But some of what's in here really does fit the trophy category. There are skulls that were removed from battlefields by the victors that were kept as trophies that have no pathological interest. They were simply picked up as trophies. There's at least a skull of a Confederate soldier picked up by a Union physician. We have a skull of a German soldier from World War I picked up by the enemy. So we have to reckon with that. And it is true that some of what's in the collection, maybe a good part of the collection, could not legally or ethically be collected today. And yet here we are. We have it. We're responsible for it. The collection is transforming over time in various ways. A good example, the skull collection you see here. These skulls constitute the most expensive purchase in the history of the museum. They have been scientifically valuable in many different eras of science. They were collected at a time when Darwin is writing, when ideas about inheritance are just beginning to be articulated. And part of the purpose of collecting these skulls, which all come from Eastern Europe, was to be able to show that there's a huge amount of variation that's natural in a population, and you cannot possibly infer cranial intelligence from cranial capacity. So that was the anatomist's goal. But since then, it has transformed into other uses. It's a very strong magnet for artists, partly because of the poignant mini-biographies of these individuals that happen to be written on the individual skulls, such as their name, age at death, cause of death, occupation, where they're from, and their religion. The religion may be a surprising attribute, but remember, 19th century physiology, 18th century physiology doesn't just reckon what your body looks like, how tall you are, and your hair color, but it also looks at your moral character, your occupation, and where you're from, the climate within which you grew up. A good example of transformation in a collection like this is war crimes investigations. After the civil wars concluded in what used to be Yugoslavia, war crimes investigators came to look at these skulls, to look at Croat skull types, to help identify war dead who were murdered. So things are not always rosy with us, and we have some problems, but one of our most popular displays is known as the Soap Lady. This is a corpse on display who had been buried for a number of years and then dug up because the cemetery had to be moved when urban renewal was going on in Philly. Well, this fellow of our college, Dr. Joseph Leidy, as you can see, absolutely poster boy of Victorian, masculine, intellectual, natural philosophy. And he's got his microscope close by as his badge of authority. He happened by this excavation of the cemetery and noticed that a woman had been dug up whose flesh had undergone a strange chemical alteration due to interaction of the decaying flesh with the minerals in the soil. In short, her skin began to saponify, turned into a substance called adipocere. He was intrigued with this phenomenon, and he purchased the corpse from the caretaker. Now, we have the receipt for this, and it's very cunningly worded, and I infer from it this was not a legal transaction even at that moment, and that Leidy thought enough money satisfies all problems, and paid, I think, $15 for her, and she's been in the museum ever since. Now, she continues to have new lives, even post-mortem, particularly scientific. Those scientists out there who are on these TV documentaries about the Iceman in the Alps and so on, always meet together at a thing called the International Mummification Conference. And the Soap Lady is a celebrity at that conference because they keep trotting out new imaging equipment and testing it out on her, and her story keeps changing. By the way, kids coming through the museum have kind of developed an urban legend around her that she died screaming. She did not. This is what happens to a corpse in the ground when the muscles go slack and the body decays. Things open. So there's no real mystery there, but I'm happy to perpetuate the idea. And I am determined on one of these April 1sts to send out a news release saying we have constructed her last words. So having her in the collection, if you really want to examine it, could be a bit of an embarrassment because even Dr. Leidy was not doing something that was within the propriety of the time. So this is where we do a brief excursion into this historical dimension of our visual heritage with human anatomy and corpses. Now, for your information, the image on the left, you notice the date, 1746, that is not a hand-colored illustration. That is an early color-printed text. And it's a landmark in printing, if not necessarily for the display of human anatomy in print. But clearly, going back some time, we have been trying to show what people look like on their insides. And the images are made to look lively even though the subject is dead. Otherwise, how can you open them up and do these illustrations? Now, the conventional way to look at these sorts of illustrations is to assume that they are aids for the medical practitioner or student, and it's also a record of what is found when the body is opened. That's true, but it's not the whole story. The images themselves convey an authority in their own right. The images themselves may communicate a picture of the body and the way it operates in a moral sense, in a physical sense, that may not exactly tally with what the body actually tells you physically. Vesalius, who published Grand Atlas, you've all seen images from Vesalius. Even Vesalius gets his landmark anatomical atlas in the public view because he introduces some corrections to the given view going back to the ancient Greeks about how the body's supposed to operate. So there are some revolutionary features in that atlas. So the atlas is operating both as a political document and it's advancing a new way to conceptualize the body. You might think, this doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're going to draw the body, why don't you draw what you see? But what conditions what you see? So actually, the atlas on the left was not very medically useful, partly because of this color printing process, but it didn't provide the image of the body that a lot of physicians actually recognized. But it's interesting to see the images carrying authority in their own right. Well, some of this imagery is not meant to be instructional for medical purposes, but for moral purposes. And you see the image of death arresting people in their life activities, reminding them, now's the time. And particularly where you see the man in the left-hand picture who's sitting down in some sort of image of authority. On the right, you have a young woman being attended to by an older woman, and the younger woman is being colored by death. So this kind of imagery, of course, was very active in a universe where your encounter with the dead was not what it is today, which is no encounter with the dead. Dead are whisked out from view. We do not have contact with corpses. They are considered dirty, and that we are not to have contact with them. Only specialized professionals get to touch corpses. This was not true when these images were put together. But even with this separation in centuries, this moral view hasn't quite escaped the picture and still has a hold on museum collections. Related to this, of course, is the memento mori imagery, the idea that we are all creatures of human vanity. We imagine ourselves important, having long lives, and influencing the world. When the reality is, of course, well, we may or may not, but we're all going to die in the end. So memento mori imagery is designed, of course, to remind you constantly that you are in a state of decrepitude and you are on your way to the grave, and square your affairs, square your moral affairs and your relationship with your maker. But what I find interesting is that memento mori imagery is returning. It doesn't have the centrality in the public view that it used to. But it's interesting just from the artists that come to work with us who are inspired by memento mori imagery and are creating new interpretations of it, which will lead to a point I'm going to be making in a moment, that I think human death imagery is coming back in interesting ways, and our power over our corpses is developing in unusual ways, and people are requesting more control, demanding more control, asserting more control over their mortal remains in ways that they didn't previously. So, models. You saw a wax model of Madame Sunday, and of course one form of representation is modeling. And even despite all the high-tech computer graphics that are available to us today, and medical students can do virtual autopsies before they actually touch a corpse, and something that was not even possible a generation ago. But wax has been a medium of representation of the body for quite some time. Now, has anyone seen this collection, by the way, La Specula in Florence? Okay, some of you have. Absolutely astounding. The cases in the foreground there on the left, where you see the legs, those are the Venus figures. You're going to see more of them in a moment. They are in attitudes ready to seduce you and then open up their bodies and show you their viscera. But consider for a moment, these are for elite consumption. These aren't necessarily for physicians to consume. What do I mean by consume? The models have to be made, and they're made based on corpses. And the challenge is to make the body look alive. For the image that you see here on the upper right, or even from the Venus figure in the lower left with his torso opened, it took up to 200 human corpses to execute one of these models. The corpse is constantly in a state of decay. So it's very, very difficult to sort of arrest decay at a moment and try to represent in some other visual medium what you're seeing. It's very, very difficult to do. So most medical illustrators choose a part or a system that they want to highlight and they don't worry about the rest of it. But here, the challenge is to get the whole thing in. So these are very expensive to make. They were very expensive to have on hand at the time. They are display artifacts, and they are also memento mori artifacts. But they also have other more sinister purposes, which I will get to in just a moment. But it's interesting that some popular culture is bringing us back around to these Renaissance and late medieval representations of our bodies, the memento mori tradition, and the theatrical presentation of anatomy, and particularly of autopsies. Peter Greenaway, if you know his films, Prospero's books, it's been several years now. His films are sometimes criticized as being art history lessons on film. Some of his films that involve artists as collaborators, their Pillow Book, this film, The Cook, the Thief, His Wife or Lover, if you've seen that, where there are vast tableaux taken from Dutch paintings of the 17th centuries. So here you see a scene from the film which you can instantly recognize as an anatomy theater. And Greenaway is absolutely fascinated not simply with an historical episode of discovering human anatomy, but its theatricalization, that it was a performance piece, that it's a performance piece in order to show virtuosity for the lecturing physician, who, by the way, didn't see patients. They lectured. That's what they did. But also to assemble all these other people in sort of rank order. So there's a lot of things going on in an image like this, and Greenaway has appropriated in the cinema. Now, somebody else who's very popular at the moment, but for a different reason, doing kind of the same thing is Wolfgang von Hagen with Body Worlds. And there are several exhibits out there that resemble Body Worlds, but with different patented processes to preserve bodies. Now, I'm not a particular fan of Body Worlds for a variety of reasons, but von Hagen's has a dedicated idea that autopsies and this exploration of human postmortem anatomy should be a very public exercise. And he likes to emulate the anatomy theater of the 17th century or the 16th century. He's trying to recreate that. Well, one of the problems that creates for his critics is that the corpses that he uses are plastinates. It's a process he has patented. But effectively, according to one critic, what he's done is he's not really created preserved people. He's created sculptures using people parts. And that the final product is not a representation of a person, but it's really an imitation of a representation of a person. He, of course, wants to use naturalistic poses, and one of the chief anatomical criticisms I would level at these is where he has a basketball player or a chess player or somebody doing something else. The bodies are not actually doing what the poses suggest they're doing. And the bodies, for example, representing athletic poses may not actually be athletic bodies. But he also takes other liberties too. And by the way, those plastinates do not necessarily preserve for good. Some of them decay and putrefy on exhibit and have to be removed. So it's not a fixed process. There are other processes out there too, where other people are trying to do the same thing. But my larger point is what this is doing for popular culture and our attitude about the dead. But since we're talking about autopsies, this is a painting you may have seen before, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. And if you see this image in a book today, you will see the triumph of spell check, which obviously does something different when it changes his name to Tulip. Most often now I see the name represented as Tulip. It's not Tulip, it's Tulp. But for these sessions, these anatomical sessions and these autopsies, there was a set procedure. This is an expression of power and authority and also religious dogma. If you were autopsying a body in a Catholic country, the autopsy proceeded through the stages of putrefaction of the body and then moved up to where the soul resides. Protestants were not quite as concerned with those steps, but there was a particular method to it that was governed by religious dogma. But it was all part of the theatrical part. Now, the image you see on the left is an absolute inversion of this. This is a photograph not meant for you to see. But there were photographs taken by medical students in the late 19th, early 20th century that was, in a way, a rite of passage for their work on corpses. So what you have here is a sleeping medical student surrounded by corpses in a partial state of dissection to represent the dream he's having, the anatomy student's dream. Now, that's a kind of a daring photograph to take, and in the 19th century, you don't dare show that outside of the privileged medical circle. Yet, that's what's going on. Lots of these have been on museum displays of late, and they're particularly challenging images. Some of them have some pretty scary racist sentiment to them, because in many cases the corpses are black, and the people, of course, doing the dissecting are white. And there was still an open question whether a black body and a white body was the same. And I've seen one of these images of a black body being dissected with white students, and written on the picture it says, "Now we will know what a coon smells like." That tells you a great deal. It also tells you a popular idea at the time that bodies actually smell differently race to race. So I'm going to leap into the 20th century and get back to our exquisite corpse again. André Breton is considered a real ideologue of the movement, and I admit he's a bit of a puffy guy in speech and is a bit of a blowhard, but he has some of the right ideas. Particularly, he says, breaking a chain of thought, finding new relationships. In a lot of art history courses, the Surrealist movement is sort of a moment on a continuum. But it's not only a moment of artistic expression in new ways, but it's a very strong political movement. And I think that this movement has had very, very profound and unrecognized influences in museums, particularly anatomy museums. And among the things that Breton articulated was to use provocation, hence the political dimension, but chance is a great part of this, particularly because at the time he's articulating these features of surrealism, psychology, psychiatry are really taking off. People like Freud, the unconscious, interest in dreams. So hence the exquisite corpses exercise. This is supposed to tap your subconscious, get you to just splash some images on paper, pass them around, join them together, and then the three disparate pieces will yield something magnificently different and provocative. But the new meanings and associations that are ascribed to things, to images, are particularly, I think, important in talking about the universe of human anatomy, its representation, and our post-mortem imagery. Play becomes a particularly important feature of this, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. So we have images like this which simply were not possible even a generation earlier. De Chirico's image uses tailor's dummies in order to create a moment of poignancy based on a mythological theme. And it's still easy to see the poignancy in these humanoid figures that aren't even human. Max Ernst did something a little bit more provocative by using collages to create, in some cases, very violent scenes, rape, murder, abduction, involving humans with animal parts or animals with human parts. And this kind of dissociation of the human body in this way was provocative then. I still think some of these images have the power to shock people, and it has a profound influence, I think, on how we see the Medical Anatomical Museum and how some of our patrons see it. And here we have an explicit use of body images in other ways, by taking the body, taking it apart, recombining its features, and particularly to reveal the psyche beneath the face. In this case, he's using bells, but we see Dali doing the same thing, with Dali even adding images based on quantum physics. So we're back to this, and I have to take a particular moment to talk about the place of women in this dialogue and in this imagery. And here's a close-up or two of the anatomical Venuses you saw in the other picture. These are figures meant for seduction. These are figures, in some cases, with one item of clothing, such as a necklace of pearls. And if you're going to be naked and have the one item, that charges it with erotic power. So these are images available to the elite. They are paid for by the elite for privileged audiences, and not necessarily medical ones. And they are fetish objects. They have erotic power, they have other power as well, and they still can disquiet you to see these images and to look at these faces and look at the features, especially when you feel yourself drawn to these images and you feel that you're getting a little excited looking at them. But then we have early medical photography taking off at a time when women move into this picture in interesting ways. The old anatomical atlases, primarily from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, are looking at men. Women are not there unless they are there as a subcategory of the male body. And it's not until men defining a medical profession claim the territory of midwives that you see serious attention being given to female bodies and anatomical atlases in the same way that male bodies got it. Women are no longer the adjunct, they now have a central place. So there you have, behind the apparent scientific nature of the imagery, a strong political current. An image like this still has a power to shock. Dr. Sims was an innovator in gynecological treatment and examination, and this model is posed to represent an examination posture. But why does this woman have to be unclothed to do this? Other images with women were using them in leotards for similar postures. A physician I know has some copies of historical medical photographs in his office, including this one, and he had to take it down when his other medical colleagues objected to it and found it highly offensive. Yet there it is, part of our medical history and part of our gynecological history. Women continue to attract interest in other ways. This image of a particular kind of albinism called piebald albinism. This is in a museum in London, and it shows you the lure, particularly of non-Western women as exotic creatures. So this painting has a lot of messages. It's not simply recording a manifestation of skin color in an unusual way, but it also is intended to have an erotic appeal and also to appeal to an audience that's going to appreciate the exotic other. Now, the tool I had to put here, because that's my next point about women, medical instruments and women and historical dimension is not a friendly coupling. Medical instruments for women frankly look like torture devices, and they may have felt like torture devices. This vaginal speculum actually gets sketched a lot as an interesting object in its own right. But this is something that even medical museums have got to think about, that they didn't have to. Women's bodies have a special set of apparatus. They have a special set of imagery that is peculiar to women. But with a largely male-dominated profession for so long, those images, those tools, had a particular status. The status has now changed because you have a lot of women physicians who are interested in this medical history specifically because of what it did to women, what it said about women's non-participation as medical professionals, and what it said about women as objects of medical work. One of the objections that's sometimes raised about cancer research is that some of the data used to try to get at breast cancer in women is based on studies using men rather than women. I mean, even these objections are coming up in the medical dialogue now. But the instrument is leading me to return to popular culture. If you haven't seen this movie, you have to see it. Cronenberg, in this film, Dead Ringers, which stars Jeremy Irons in two roles, two brothers who happen to be gynecological researchers and innovators. They have invented special tools for gynecology in this film. This film has, I think, one of the most profound explorations of the medicalization of women's bodies, the male medicalization of women's bodies, and the instruments the physicians use to open up and explore women's bodies. It's this film. Here is Jeremy Irons as one of the physicians being suited up for surgery, and he has a nervous breakdown during the film, and as he is an innovator, he takes some designs for new medical tools to an artist, a metal artist, who makes these instruments up. And the artist says, "I'm fascinated by the designs, what are they?" And the doctor responds, "They're gynecological instruments for operating on mutant women." Now, the character here has a nervous breakdown owing to a love affair with an actress. The actress happens to have a very unusual physical circumstance with her birthing parts, which he calls a trifurcate. Don't know what that is. But the woman says, "Well, what does that mean?" She says, "It's fabulously rare, fabulously rare." He talks about it as an absolutely beautiful anomaly, even though it prevents her from having children. And yet, these are the tools that he has designed. And by the way, he deploys them in a surgical operating room, and he takes the instrument up right and starts to make an incision with it before the fellow physicians and nurses say, "Hey, wait a minute, stop this." And they remove him from the operating room. I am determined to get these for display in my museum. But this is a pretty amazing thing, I think, for mainstream cinema to take up, and particularly to take up in this way. See the film. And there's also explicit reference to Chang and Eng in it. So moving through this art territory, a brief moment about the legalities. We did talk about special laws regarding Native American artifacts, human remains, and associated funerary artifacts. These are photographs from a criminal case that I had something to do with, but this is an example of what goes on. These are people of a self-identified archaeology club digging up Native American graves. They wouldn't think of going to a church cemetery with tombstones and digging up their own ancestors, but somehow it's okay when they're Indians. So they're digging up 500-year-old Native Americans, and it's family picnic time. This boy was assigned a grave of a boy to dig up. So you see a corpse in that grave, and you see white specks that were white shells that were stitched into the wrappings around the body. So these people were all committing felonies, and they haven't sought any permission to do this. They wouldn't get permission from the state to do it, and yet they were doing it. So this activity goes on, and it goes on internationally. There's a commercial trade in the human remains and the artifacts, but more and more there are other voices that are being leveled against this activity who now have the legal apparatus to back up their sense of retribution about this. But we also now have in this country a strong Hispanic influence. The Day of the Dead is now very popular around Halloween time, even though some of its more cultural associations have been removed, the imagery has been preserved. But it also speaks to a huge influx of Spanish-speaking people in this country from Caribbean. Some of them have arrived also practicing religious rituals that are not recognized by mainstream Americans. Santeria, Palo Mayombe. These are Afro-Caribbean beliefs in some cases coming up from the Caribbean. And the rituals sometimes involve shrines at home that incorporate human remains. So that imagery is becoming more and more popular. It is affecting the environment of my museum. And in fact, we even do a Day of the Dead celebration where we do talk about the rituals associated with this. But this painting here is interesting because it shows a dead child. And just as I had a special moment to talk about women, we should talk about children for just a moment. This is the most politically volatile collection, part of our collection right now. It's interesting that this whole area of deformed births still carries a label that it carried in the 18th century, which is teratology, monstrous births. The genetic basis for these kinds of anomalies are well known now, but of course they were anomalous at the time these births occurred, these anomalies, deformities, whatever category you want to put it in. And this is what, of course, medical museums collected for study. And particularly in an era before genetics, there was a desperate attempt to understand what's going on here. But yet, even though these specimens are not collected by medical schools anymore, not used in training, we still have them. But we do get requests sometimes from teachers that we hide them from display when they bring their school kids. We do not do that. But it is part of the dialogue that is unresolved. And we also have a lot of imagery of not dead children, but live ones, but who exhibit, in this case, congenital deformities. It's strange to see what happens to context with photographs like this. There was, I forget which Northeastern university created a website through its medical school on certain dermatological conditions. And they incorporated some historical medical photographs of this kind, showing children who are naked displaying themselves for a medical photograph. They were visited by the FBI because the FBI discovered that somebody had collected these images, downloaded them from the hospital website, and was using them for a porn site. So there was another audience that was using these images for pornographic satisfaction. This creates problems. Now, in looking at the post-mortem gaze, if I could call it that seems to be emerging, we even have traveling exhibits now showing this corpse, which I find very interesting, artifacts from burials in China, the beauty of Xiaohe. Here, this exhibit is promoted through the image of a corpse who is identified in all the advertising promotional literature as beautiful. Now, this is fascinating because it's one of the first times I have seen a traveling museum exhibit that takes as its icon the image of a dead person and says, "This is beauty." So where are we going with this? The public and private spheres are indeed emerging. You've seen the skeleton that we have in our collection a moment ago, but here's a man who walked in the museum recently who picked up his pants legs and said, "See, I had that image tattooed on my calves." Well, we see this. The imagery that's no longer in the preserve of physicians, imagery of the kind I'm showing you is now gone mainstream. And as you know, everybody is willing to film themselves doing anything and placing it on YouTube. It doesn't matter what it is. You can find it out there. So the personal, professional spheres, the boundaries are dissolving, particularly with display of bodies, both live and dead. And I'm wondering if we are, in the mainstream, moving to articulating a new ethic of display, an aesthetic even, of what is acceptable to display, what themes can be explored very dispassionately in a variety of fora, not just in the medical museum. And just when I think that there's some area of medical imagery that has still not gone mainstream, somebody always shows me that it's gone mainstream. So I think we're leading to something here. And we get this. Now, I'm a fan of this guy. And yet, he has made a career of retailing this kind of grotesque imagery. And I don't even know if it shocks anybody anymore, except grandparents, because it's so campy. And, you know, here's Alice Cooper, who has an educational foundation, gives a lot of money to charity and all this other stuff. And yet, it's out there. And the fact that he has done this for years has made it mainstream. It's made it mainstream to even look at post-mortem images in a comic way. So the increasing access to imagery is really interesting. If you haven't seen this book is on the reading list out there. When I gave you the example of the photograph of the black man being dissected, how does a coon smell? It comes from this book and this traveling exhibit. This is a book full of images that were never meant for public viewing to show how anatomy students, how medical students are joking among themselves and how they want to present themselves to their colleagues. The pamphlet on the left was kind of interesting because London had an interesting exhibit that were dead people found in London. And it was interesting because the Wellcome collection presented these to the public as your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues. You are Londoners. And underneath your feet is that 14th century man who died of the plague, is that 15th century man who died in battle, is that woman who died of cholera. And I found it one of the most powerfully intimate introductions of living museum patrons to the dead that I've ever seen. And this is becoming more common. Medical imaging is changing, and there's been a return in some cases to whole body imagery rather than photomicrographs, the close-ups of the viscera and so on. And this leads to other things. One of the universities with a medical school in Philadelphia identifies for its students the corpses that they are going to dissect. They learn that these are not anonymous beings, but they have names, histories. They are introduced to family members before they perform the dissection as part of a humanistic medicine program. It seems rather odd that you have to have a domain of medical learning that's actually called humanistic medicine, but there it is. This is one of my favorite photographs in the collection because it's really hard to conceive what would bring these three people of such obviously disparate backgrounds together to sit in this intimate way. But let's get back to play, and as I conclude here, some of you may know the films of the Quay brothers, I hope. The film that made them famous is a stop-motion film where you have these dolls as tailors' dummies, work in a tailor shop, that actually take this man who's the interloper and they remake him, and they remake him with viscera. So we have a playful reconstruction with due reference to anatomical imagery that extends back to the Renaissance. But it also leads to ideas here. This skeleton in our collection of Harry Eastlack is one that those of us in the museum feel a particularly close connection to. This man had a rare disease, and I won't give you the details. It's a rare disease, but what happens is particularly creepy. Your genes one day tell your muscles and connective tissue to stop making muscles and connective tissue, but instead start making bone. So you have a skeleton, and all of a sudden you grow a second skeleton. Skeleton's perfectly normal, but it's not supposed to be there. So you can see patches of the connective tissue that have ossified. And by the time this man died, short of age 40, he was one fused bone. Couldn't even open his mouth anymore. This is so scary that people with this disease could be walking out that doorway, hit an elbow, and in the space of 24 hours, that elbow will permanently ossify in this configuration. There's no cure, and any attempt to open up the body to fix it brings it more aggressively on. So it's a pretty scary thing. But is there some play possible here? I put the armor here because what if we juxtaposed armor and the design and creation of armor and what it's supposed to do for the body alongside a body that's producing its own armor? So the Quay brothers, I sought to make a film, and they did, and they made a half-hour film. And it was interesting to allow artists free rein and how they apprehend all of this imagery, what they want to do with post-mortem lives, and how they want to create them. And just as with the puppet film, it was striking, the puppet film they did earlier, they chose an interlocutor, somebody that is the one who makes the inquiry, and you watch them make the inquiry. In other words, in the film, they wanted to use Harry Eastlack's story. That magnetized their interest, because his sister used to come to the museum to visit his post-mortem remains. That was the linchpin of the film. They wanted to create imagery and music that spoke to the visiting of the dead in a museum setting and ruminate on that. So that is a form of play that I'm actively pursuing. So do we return to some of these surrealist ideas? Manufacturing some of the articles one meets in one's dream. So my suggestions, and this is how we are thinking this through in my own museum, is what should be a new discourse about postmortem imagery, and how should we bring it into a museum setting and experiment with it? And our best avenue right now is frankly to work with artists, to realize an artistic vision of what we might do and what the possibilities might be. Even Peter Greenaway, whose film Prospero's Books I had up earlier, I spent some time with him. I'm trying to get him interested in making a film based on our collections. And his first question to me was, I have an idea for a project, but how would you feel about using fresh corpses? I said, well, let's talk about it. What could he possibly want to do? And would it really be out of bounds to do it? I don't know. The inventive associations and contexts are why I'm relying on artists, because we're getting some pretty provocative ideas, and more artists, I think, are coming to us than ever before, because now the door is open, and the Gray Brothers film has put us up an artistic horizon that announces to the art world that we are interested in this kind of collaboration. Not every museum is willing to do it. New associations is very Andre Breton, but could we also be a broker of cultural perspectives? That's going to be a difficult one. We've tried to do a little work with Day of the Dead, but we haven't really captured the attention of the Hispanic community in Philadelphia to do it. And I'm not so sure what our success might be in doing this. But I still think working with artists is our best route to exploring the possibilities. So, fully in tune with Andre Breton and our exquisite corpse exercise, these are sort of my parting words. So there's no firm conclusions here, just some provocative ideas, but these are the topics that we ruminate on. So I thank you very much. Now I'm watching the clock. I don't know if we have time for many questions, but we want to draw from the submissions here the prize drawing too. Should we do that, or should we entertain a question or two if people have them?
We can take about 3 questions.
Okay. And remember, we have microphones if you've got a question. No questions. Question?
Could you say more about the relationship?
I'm sorry.
Could you say more about the relationship?
It's on.
Between anatomy dissection and the soul and religion?
Yes, it's really interesting that, as you know, there's a checkered history with getting corpses for legal autopsies. You know, medical school students stealing them from grave cemeteries and all that. So against that kind of backdrop of where you get corpses, where you had legitimate venues for a dissection, which was in a university setting in the 16th and 17th centuries, in the Jesuit world, Catholic world, the Jesuits were particularly doctrinal about this. There was a prescribed method for how you do the autopsy, what you do first, what you open first, second, third. The limbs were frequently not opened. It was a progression through the sequence of putrefaction in the body, leading through the hierarchy of the seat of your intelligence and the seat of your soul, which, you know, migrated, wasn't always in the head. So that was doctrinally prescribed. It had to be done in a particular way, or you were in trouble with authorities. In that handout with bibliography, for those of you that want to take on that bibliography, you'll see some titles that are specific to this inquiry, where you could follow this up. Was there another question? We have 2 more. There's a gentleman here with a question, and in the back. Okay.
I was especially interested in your focus on play, but it occurred to me that people who have political, or as I say, sensitivities of various sorts with human remains, including those in the Mütter, might not take very well to that approach, and might consider it just a sort of another way of disrespecting this material.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could, that's not my concern, but I can imagine that as an objection. So I was wondering if you could perhaps defend play and playfulness and artistic sort of creative response to this material as a constructive way forward with it.
You raise a very good point. I mean, we obviously can't indulge in a lot of, say, grim gallows humor without offending people. In the same way that, you know, people that drive ambulances and work in emergency medical rooms have private jokes. We still have to maintain credibility as a scientific institution. And we do have a variety of scientific projects in progress. And we do have to show that we are a repository of history. But this is particularly where the artists come in. And the Quay brothers are a good example. Even the short film, half-hour film they made, has some moments of play that are not disrespectful, but I think certainly qualify as play. I think we just have to be careful about that. The sensitivity is not a line that can be absolutely defined. We're about to take this on because at the moment we have a no photography policy in our museum. You can get permission under special circumstances, but we're having a meeting to review whether we want to abandon that altogether. People come through with their smartphones to take pictures anyway. And people post images to the internet, and most of the time I'm interested to see are not even museum or things that we own. They're somebody else's, but they're attributed to us. And sometimes those images raise the ire of a lot of people on the internet. So there's no fixed way I can describe how we might do this. But even if we took the Harry Eastlack skeleton and displayed it next to armor, is a form of play. And there's a small association of people that suffer from the disease he had. It's a small group. It's estimated that maybe there are as many as 7,000 people in the world with his disease. There's no cure. But even the people who have the disease treat Harry as an icon that validates their experience. And I think, just based on conversations I've had with a few FOP sufferers, they would be interested in seeing Harry incorporated into some imaginative exercises. It also takes the pressure off of them in recognizing that they have a terminal progressive disease. So we have to take these ideas a little bit case by case. One example that is a form of play, I suppose, is where Mary Roach, I mentioned Mary Roach a moment ago. We have a thing in the curator's office, frankly, it's called the ASS file. And what's in the ASS file is some doctors put together a file of highly technical medical reports all about strange things people put up their rectal passages. And it's colloquially known as the ASS file. This is why interns have to get through lunch, and get this. And actually, Mary Roach was intrigued because the paper in there that intrigued her the most was a very technical, with illustrations, article about a man who put a ping pong ball up there and couldn't get it out. So to get it out, he had the imaginative idea of pouring concrete up his rectum and let it solidify around the ping pong ball so he could pull it out. Well, that didn't work, but the concrete set. So what do you do with something like this? Do you interpret it to the public? Do you have anything to say about it at all? Well, in this case, the play was Mary Roach is a big friend of ours. And Mary Roach's latest book, Gulp, is on the gastrointestinal tract. What would Mary Roach do with this? The ASS file's in her book. That's a form of play. That might still offend some people, but those are examples of how we've done this, or how we're thinking about doing this. I don't think any of those ideas are particularly outlandish, but if we get a bad response, we would probably retreat from it and just let it alone and try something else. So there's no fixed answer I can give you about that. That's the best I think I can do. I think we had time for more questions. A gentleman here, and then the prizes.
Yes, I represent a nearby museum, and we have two Egyptian mummies, one that is partially wrapped and one that is not. And the people there are struggling with display of these versus not display. I sort of want to get your opinion on what you think about the display of the mummy in the art museum.
Boy, that's a tough one, because I have once protested the display of a mummy in an art museum, or at least asked the museum what was their policy on the display of human remains, and they gave me a runaround. I was not director of the museum, so I didn't approach them, director to director. I was just a patron of the museum. I still have mixed feelings about just putting an Egyptian mummy on display. And particularly when parents bring young children to see the mummies. These are mummies, of course, these are dead bodies that were not intended at all for display in any of the contexts where you find them now. You can easily make the argument this is our Western prerogative to just do this because it suits us. I think there may be circumstances in which I would say the mummy could go on display. I'm not sure I could articulate what all those circumstances are, but I would think that the museum should first of all consider, does it have a policy on the display of human remains as art? because they may very well get or have in their collections art that incorporates human body material. Even in the benign way, Marcel Duchamp, his work, The Great Glass in Philadelphia, has human parts in it. Well, they're his. But that doesn't seem to raise an issue for the museum. I think a museum should have a policy about it, and it should be something communicated to their public. And they may do what some museums have done, which is isolate the body in the exhibit so that maybe only certain people get to see it. I have mixed feelings about doing it that way too. I don't like museums that say, no kids in this room, adults only. I think that's not a good idea. So I'm giving you a wishy-washy answer on this. I mean, you know, I had a museum where we got corpses on display. And I have seen Egyptian mummies on display where I thought it's utterly inappropriate to do it. Some, I think, purists on this issue will even challenge some of the funerary items that are sometimes put on display, even without the humans present. I've seen so many Egyptian exhibits that I've been offended by the human remains simply stacked up just as another artifact for display. And I have problems with that. I think the museum at least is under an obligation to create a context about the Egyptian world of death. And how to display it, I don't know. I probably would have to give you a better answer with a very specific case that I've looked into and might have some strong opinions about. I think it's a hard one. And as we both know, museums do this all the time, particularly with Egypt. But it's interesting that even the Egyptian government is occasionally extending a hand to say, don't do it that way. Not right. This needs a different context or a different sensitivity. So I don't know if that answer was useful to you. It may be too wishy-washy. But it does vex me a lot. I do think about this. Thank you very much.